So thanks for tuning in. I'm going to be talking about how you can use social media to boost your academic career. Now, I hope you're keeping safe as well with the coronavirus. And speaking of the coronavirus, I actually had a talk that was scheduled for today, but it was cancelled as a result of the virus. And I thought, well, I wouldn't want to let this opportunity go to waste. So instead of not presenting the presentation, I wanted to share what I was going to be presenting right here on Twitter via Periscope. So this talk also coincides with a book, a free ebook that I recently launched, which was on for Twitter for scientists, how scientists can use Twitter to boost their academic careers. And look, the motivation behind this book is that this isn't the first time I've done a talk like this about social media for academics. But quite often in these talks, I don't really want to focus on the mechanics of how to use Twitter. I want to talk about why you should be using Twitter and why you should be using social media. But at the same time, I didn't really have a reference that I could refer people to when it came to the nuts and bolts of using Twitter. So as a result, I wrote a book. I wrote an ebook, which I've put out for free. And I'm going to put the link to that. I'm going to mention the link to that later on in this talk. But this talk is more about why you should be using social media for your academic career. Now, let's. I think it's when it comes to disseminating our research, there are two main audiences that we're really interested in. Firstly, it's the public. I think it's really important that we're actually talking to the public about our work because they're funding our salaries and they're funding our research. And it's really important when it comes to these funding levels that the public is actually interested and actually has a vested interest in what we're doing. If we're not actually telling the public what we're doing with our research in accessible ways, then when it comes to governments actually deciding budgets, if governments want to slash research budgets, and if the public don't really care, then they're not going to kick up a stink. So it's really important that we're actually communicating to the public and writing papers. And it's great that people are actually doing open access papers, but that isn't enough. We need to actually be using channels where the public are actually paying attention, and academic papers don't tend to be that sort of way. But of course, the other group of people that we want to talk to is other scientists, so we can actually spread the work that we're doing. Now, if you do have any questions during the presentation, please let me know, and I can answer them near the end, and I can actually see them, and I can pop up the questions as well. So I've already got Lynn Air who said hello, but that's great. If you've got any questions, please feel free because I can see them all. Okay, now, when it comes to sharing our work, there are really only four ways for our research to be known. Firstly, it's to already be famous, and not many of us are lucky like that. Secondly, you may be attached to, or you may have a famous mentor as well. And if you do, lucky you. If you do have that famous mentor, then they can actually be promoting your work to all their colleagues. Secondly, you could repeatedly win the peer review lottery. Now, I've been in this game for long enough to know that you might have such a solid paper, but it's in many circumstances, it's honestly the luck of the draw when it comes to how things are going to be dealt with in peer review, both with the editor, but also the peer reviewer. And those things are largely out of your control. But fourth, the other way that you can actually make your research known as an early career researcher that you can have complete control over is to actively contribute to social media. That's one thing that we can all do, regardless of what university that you're at, regardless of who your mentor is, and regardless of whether you're already famous. You can actually, by contributing actively to social media, be it Twitter, be it Facebook, or whatever platform you're using, or podcast, for instance, doing it that way, you can actually better access other people. Because right now, the situation that we have is that academia is full of gatekeeping. There is gatekeeping everywhere. Now, to give an example, firstly, let's talk about the traditional media. If you're wanting to share your work to the public using the traditional media, right now, you are limited by whatever the editor thinks when it comes to what's actually shared, whether it's shared in the first place, and the timeline as well. And previously, if you did want to get your work maybe 10, 20 years shared, it'd be a newspaper. Maybe if you're lucky, it'd be a TV spot or perhaps the radio. But once again, this comes back to this idea that if you're already famous, or you have a famous mentor, or you happen to get your paper in a very fancy journal, then doing this will be much easier. But the great thing with social media is that you can actually get around those gatekeepers when it comes to sharing your work, whether it's by text, whether it's by video, or whether it's by audio as well. And when it comes to scientific journals, it's exactly the same thing, and it's a thing which a lot of us have experienced. In that the scientific journals decide whether it's the editors or whether it's the peer reviewers, but mostly the editors decide what is published and how quickly this is published. Now, this is the traditional publication system where you'll write your paper. This might take a year. It might take even years when it comes to collecting your data and going through ethics approvals and all those kind of things. You work hard, you submit your paper, and then it goes to the peer reviewers, and then it goes to the editors. If you're lucky, or maybe you'll get a desk rejection, but then if you're lucky, you'll actually get your paper returned to you. And then you have this whole cycle of wanting to share your work out in the public to other scientists. However, you have these gatekeepers there of editors and of peer reviewers. And if you're absolutely lucky and everything goes well, maybe there's a 3-month minimum between you actually sharing and submitting your work and it actually getting published so that other scientists can read that. But this process takes an incredibly long time. And in many circumstances, it can actually be quite unfair. But when it comes to social media and preprints, you can actually give instant access to both the public, but more particularly, you can give instant access to other researchers as well. You don't have to wait to get past these gatekeepers in order to share your work. Now, a lot of people say, well, that's why we have peer review. Peer review makes sure that we don't actually let any trash through, and when it comes to preprints, we can't actually be sure of what the quality is of these preprints. But the reality is there's a lot of published work which also is of questionable quality, so I don't think that is a very strong argument. So as long as you're actually upfront, and most preprint servers are upfront saying this is not peer-reviewed work, at least other scientists can actually see the work that you're doing. And I think when it comes to coronavirus, this is a fantastic example of how science should be done. A lot of journals who previously wouldn't actually allow you to submit papers which have been previously submitted as a preprint are now waiving their rules, understanding how important it is for the public and for other scientists to actually see this research as quick as possible. So even the publishers realize that the current policies of not actually letting your research out there as quickly as possible is detrimental both to the public and both to science as well. Now, like I mentioned before, social media and podcasts can actually get around gatekeeping, so you can actually share your work immediately. And when it comes to how we communicate our research online, both to the public and to other scientists, there are 3 main mediums, and these things are never going to change. You've got audio, which for now is primarily podcast, but traditionally has been radio. You've also got text as well for social media, Twitter, Facebook, and blogs. And you've also got images, whether they're still images, which tends to be the sort of thing you see on Instagram. But you've also got moving images like YouTube, and more recently, you've got TikTok, which is becoming incredibly popular. I believe it's one of the most downloaded apps across all of the app stores around the world. A lot of people are using TikTok. I was actually at a supermarket a day or two ago, and I heard some people talking about some health advice around the coronavirus, and they were talking about, well, I heard on TikTok. So a lot of people are actually getting their information and their news on TikTok. It's incredible. So you've got these 3 main mediums of how people are actually communicating, and these things are likely to change over time. A lot of us are old enough, like me, to be around when MySpace was quite huge. And a lot of people, when I talk about this kind of stuff, going, what about MySpace? Why should I waste my time on Twitter, on TikTok, on YouTube, when these things could end up being like MySpace, and these things people could just stop using them? And that might be the case. But the reality is we actually do get a lot of practice, because these things are always going to be the same. You're always going to be writing text in some way, whether it's Twitter, whether it's some sort of blog. You're always going to be sharing video. The platform may change, but video is video. And you're always going to be sharing audio in some way or another. So even if these platforms are going to die, one, it doesn't matter, because this is where people are paying attention right now. There's that famous saying that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago or today. And that's exactly the same when it comes to social media. You can't just sit on the fence going, oh, well, Twitter might not be around in a couple of years, because you're never going to get started. So it's really important to realize that you're always going to be working across these three mediums when it comes to sharing your work. Thanks for listening and sending in your comments. Before I go into the next slide, got a question. Whether these slides will be available online, and yes, afterwards I'll post the link to where these slides would be. But yes, please keep on asking your questions, and if there are some more and some longer ones, I will do a Q&A session at the end. So to give an example of why I think sharing your work online to the public is important, I want to give an example from my own research. Now, for my research, I look and I work with the neuropeptide oxytocin, which is produced naturally, almost exclusively in the brain. And quite often, at least within popular culture, it's known as the love hormone. Now, this is a really attractive story, thinking that this is one hormone which causes us to go and hug people and to be happy. But unfortunately, that's not the case. The research simply is not consistent with that idea. And I've been doing a lot of work, at least within an academic sense, of actually figuring out what oxytocin actually does, but also trying to dispel these myths and shifting this idea of oxytocin being the love hormone to oxytocin being more of a regulatory hormone. And I've been trying to do a lot of work, and I think this is important, because if we continually see oxytocin as this hormone that only works with positive emotions and only works for social behavior, then I really believe this can limit the type of research that we're going to do if we're going to be using oxytocin potentially in the clinic. If we're only seeing this as a positive or a love hormone, we're only going to be doing research on these areas. However, if we actually better recognize what oxytocin does, then this can open up avenues for future research. So I think it's really important both for scientists but also the lay public to do this. And I've been, for the past few years, talking about this quite a lot, both to the public through blogs, but also through Twitter as well. And to give a recent example, it was Valentine's Day last month in February, and this is a thread that I posted on Twitter. I actually posted it 2 years ago, but I posted it again because I think it was a good one. And this was more targeted to a lay audience, but also other scientists, about Twitter, and that despite the label of the love hormone, it's not actually the love hormone, but the truth or the reality or the research is much more interesting than oxytocin being a love hormone. And this particular thread, although I've talked about this idea in papers, if I'm lucky, maybe this paper might get a couple of hundred downloads, maybe 1,000 if I'm really lucky for a published paper. Yet this particular thread was seen over 70,000 times, incredible numbers, and it wasn't just scientists who were seeing this. This was also the lay public who had found out, and a lot of people, particularly a lot of mothers, a lot of breastfeeding mothers, were telling me, when I was breastfeeding, I was told about how this hormone is meant to make me happy. Yet I didn't actually feel those feelings, and I didn't feel like I was a real mother, so to speak, because I wasn't getting these feelings that I was supposed to get. So a lot of people. And a lot of people in the public actually felt a lot of relief when they heard that oxytocin wasn't necessarily the lovey-dovey or the cuddle hormone. So it's really important to actually be sharing our stuff. And by doing this on Twitter, these things can actually go quite a long way. Now, for a more recent example, this is a paper which came out yesterday, which was talking about how you can create synthetic data sets which share the same statistical properties as a real data set, And so you can recreate the analyses and do exploratory work, yet none of the actual case-wise variables match the original data. So you can share your data freely without risk of, or with almost no risk of actually revealing the identity of people that were taking part in the study. But the thing about this particular study was that this was almost entirely made on Twitter. The idea came from Twitter. I think it was a tweet that I saw almost a year and a half ago, where people were having a conversation about this very problem of how can we share data for populations that are sensitive. For instance, a lot of work that I do is with adults with autism in Oslo. A recent study was only between the ages of 18 and 30, and that population is really small. So it's quite easy to actually potentially identify people who are taking part in the study. So it's not as easy to actually say, I'm going to make my data open. But with synthetic data, you can actually share your data this way. And so I think this was a really exciting thing. The idea was on Twitter, and across the entire process of the paper, I was asking questions and sharing ideas and getting feedback. People told me I was wrong. Of course, you always get a bit angry when someone tells you you're wrong, but they were right in the end. And this is really important feedback to get, because you never know what's going to happen in the peer review process. Obviously, peer reviewers are doing a fantastic job, but you never know if they're going to miss an important point that people are going to see when you're actually sharing your stuff before publication. This has probably been the most transparent paper that I've ever done. With this particular paper, I was thinking out loud on Twitter. I was sharing my ideas, the tools that I found. I even live streamed the coding for the paper and the writing, which was terrifying. I'm not the best writer, so to actually do this live was quite an experience. But it doesn't matter, because a lot of people are sort of very, very worried about, I don't want to share my work, someone's going to steal my ideas, or my work's not going to be novel. But this paper of being completely transparent via Twitter and via social media was a fantastic example of, if you're being completely transparent with your work, you're going to get a lot of feedback. And that feedback that you get, and the fact that people are going to be aware of the work that you're doing, is going to be far outweighs the sort of work, or far outweighs any of the downsides that you're going to get from people potentially stealing your idea, which I don't think in many circumstances is going to happen. Now, I want to quickly talk about some other more emerging platforms other than Twitter. And like I mentioned before, I think TikTok is a really is a really exciting platform. If you haven't heard of TikTok, you essentially upload very short videos, about 15 seconds, typically with music, and there's a lot of memes that are shared with TikTok. And for this particular meme that I shared, I was talking about the same sort of story, that oxytocin isn't necessarily the love hormone. I've been trying to say this stuff for so long. The preprint where I've talked about this the most has been downloaded just over 400 times. But when it came to the actual TikTok video, it's been seen within the course of a day or two, over 25,000 times. And once again, a lot of people who were sharing this post, or a lot of people who were interacting with this post they weren't necessarily scientists. They were people but they were both scientists that were surprised by this, because that's what they were told in their first year psychology class. But it was also members of the lay public that would never have seen this preprint. But by doing a quick 15-second video on TikTok, which took me, in total, this maybe took me 5 minutes to make, I was able to actually share my research far, far beyond what I could ever do with the preprint, or whether this was a story in the newspaper, for instance. We have to always be thinking about where people are actually paying attention. And right now, all you have to do is look at all you have to do is look at where people are actually paying attention. You can be on the train, on the way to work, or on the bus, and people are always staring on their phones. So I think it's really important as scientists, and this is both the public and scientists as well. I really think it's important for scientists to get in front of that. Now let's move to the next slide. Got a bit of delay here. I think podcasts are an extremely underused area when it comes to science communication, both to the public and both to other scientists. And I quickly want to talk about Everything Hertz, which is a podcast that I co-host, and it's a fantastic way of actually sharing your work with people quite regularly. So what we do is we release episodes twice a month, and it's just me and me and my co-host James, and we're just chatting, and we sometimes get guests on the show as well. And we also live stream some of our podcasts on Twitter as well, and post them on videos. And the fantastic thing with podcasts is it's a really accessible way for people to take in information. People can do this while they're doing other things, and a lot of our listeners, when they tune in, they or when they contact us, they let us know, I do this while I'm walking the dog. I do this when I'm washing the dishes. I'm doing this when I'm doing menial lab tasks or doing sort of boring data entry. It's one of those things that you can do other things while you're listening to a podcast. And I think that's it's a really good use of time as well. That's how I listen to podcasts when I'm actually commuting and on the way to work. I'm listening to other podcasts by doing that, because it's very hard to walk to work and to be reading papers. So by actually having a podcast, you can you can reach people who wouldn't otherwise be able to actually take in the information that you're sharing. And it's also a really great way to build your network by having guests on your show. When it comes to the guests that we have on our show, myself and James is thinking about who would be someone really interesting to talk to, or who's doing stuff that's very similar to our work, and we invite them on. I think we've had about 20 guests on the show, and of all the people we've invited, I think there's only one person who hasn't responded to us, and funnily enough, they were someone who does science communication of all things. But every single other person, both ranging from PhD students to very senior professors, have said yes. So it's a really great way to actually network and get to know other researchers in your field. Because the funny thing is, when you ask someone to talk about their research, they're almost always going to say yes. So make sure you take advantage of that and use that as an opportunity to meet people who are doing some really cool stuff in your field. And like I mentioned before, it's a really good use of time compared to other communication types, in the sense that for me personally, when it comes to writing, I'm actually quite a slow writer, and I'm very self-critical about my writing, and it can take me such a long time even to write a relatively short blog post. But for me to actually share my ideas, it's much quicker to do a podcast. I could share the ideas that I'm sharing right now about social media as a blog post, and that would take me hours and hours of time. But right now, I'm spending about 20 minutes just chatting away, because there isn't as much pressure when it comes to when you're talking versus when you're actually writing. So I think it's a really good use of time, especially if you happen to be a slow writer like myself. Podcasts work really well. And it also opens doors to talk invitations. The talks are very important, especially for early career researchers like myself. When it comes to your CV, but also when it comes to actually sharing your ideas and meeting other people. And the funny thing is, when you actually look at conferences and you happen to see the same names from conference to conference to conference, one of the main reasons that is that it's a case of familiarity. That when the organisers are looking at who are we going to invite to our talk, they can at least say, well, I've seen that lady do a talk previously. I know they can do a nice talk, because I know she can do a good talk. I'm going to invite her again, because I know he can pull in a crowd. I'm going to invite them again I'm going to invite them to my research. And it's kind of this vicious cycle, because it's the same people getting invited because that's who we're seeing. But when it comes to podcasts, you can actually get around these gatekeepers of who is actually getting invited to these conferences or to these seminars by presenting and going, hey, I've got just a little bit of expertise about this work, and people can actually get to know your expertise through your podcast. So I think of the maybe 6 or 7 talks I did last year, I'd say about 2/3 were from people who have actually heard about my work through the podcast. It wasn't because of the papers that I wrote. It was more about the podcast to talk about the papers that I wrote. So it's a fantastic opportunity there. So like I mentioned before, I recently published a free online book. It's a HTML book on Twitter for scientists, and you can go through. I've talked about how important it is for scientists to be on social media because it gets around gatekeepers. But when it comes to the practicalities of how to actually do this, have a read of this book. It's not quite often when you hear people go, I've got a free ebook, you have to sign up to some horrible mailing list and you're going to get spam. No mailing lists. This is completely free. You just log on and you can read the book online, and maybe in the future I'll print it out. But for now it's always going to be free online. So have a look through for some tips and some practical tips on how to use Twitter as well. And there's several practical examples for sharing your work and for building your network there. And if you're thinking about starting your own podcast, I've also wrote a short guide on how you can do this. It's not as complicated as you think. If you can do this almost for free, there's a fantastic new service or new-ish service called Anchor, and you can just record your voice straight into your phone. The quality isn't going to be great, but if you want to get started, Anchor is a free way to get started with your own podcast. But at the bare minimum, I would suggest that you get a mic, which is about sort of $30 to $40 or to $50 US, a USB mic. That's the only thing that you're going to need for doing a good podcast, because you can get basic hosting for free. I recommend a service called Acast. And you can do really impressive editing or audio editing for free as well with a service called Auphonic. All the details are here in this podcast guide, which you can read here. Which you can read on my blog for starting your own podcast. It's not as hard as you think. Okay, so I want to convince you, and I hope that I've convinced you that social media and podcasts can level the playing field for early career researchers. Right now, we have the situation where senior researchers or more experienced researchers can actually get through these gatekeepers, the gatekeepers for sharing our work a lot easier. But when you're an early career researcher, by actually using social media, you can get around these gatekeepers to share your work, both to researchers and also to the public. Thanks for listening in. I've got a few questions now, which I'm going to go through. And if you do have a burning question, now is the time to write it in, because I'll answer it now. But these are the ways that you can contact me. DS Quintana on TikTok. I made a few videos, like you've seen. Also on Facebook as well. Now, Facebook is interesting. I think it's very difficult to break through on Facebook because Facebook is almost too popular. In that you sort of have to think about. It's almost a supply and demand thing. With Facebook, there are so many people there's so much content out there on Facebook and not enough people watching. So in order to actually get people to see your content, you have to pay for ads. That is the only way that you can consistently get people to actually find out about your work. And that's not the sort of thing that early career researchers or any researchers have the money for, to actually pay ads for people to see our work. Now, when it comes to other platforms, for TikTok, you basically have a lot of people who are who are watching TikTok, but not enough people who are creating stuff. And because you have that imbalance, it's very easy to make a video which is seen by a lot of people. Twitter is about in the middle there when you have to the amount when you're looking at the amount of people that are actually consuming stuff on the platform versus the amount of people that are actually making stuff. So that's why I don't think Facebook is the best sort of thing to work on. But personally, I have a Facebook fan page that I post stuff on just to have a presence on Facebook. But when it comes to the actual stuff, or the actual response I get compared to Twitter, it's not even close. So I think it's worth doing something there, but not necessary. Okay, so I'm going to go through. I'm going to go through some of the questions. Okay, someone's also mentioned Mo_Fodil. I'll put this question on here. Has said, what about LinkedIn? I think LinkedIn was, yeah, the second question about LinkedIn. LinkedIn has kind of been the butt of jokes about it's just a really bad way to get spammed by your friends. But I actually think it has a lot of potential. Firstly, if you're considering moving from academia to industry, industry lives on industry lives on LinkedIn, and I think unfortunately the permanent positions in academia are shrinking. So we always have to keep our options open for what we're going to be doing after we finish our PhDs and after we're going to be finishing our postdocs as well. So I know a lot of people that have set up their so-called academic backup plans, thinking about what they're going to do to make the switch to industry. If you're working in the biobehavioral sciences, data science is one great example of how to do that. And by having a presence on LinkedIn, at least you can leave the door open for speaking with industry. And there's a lot of people, once again, who are writing posts on LinkedIn and getting a lot, incredible amount of reads of their stuff. So, so right now, look, I think it's worth having a LinkedIn page and putting some stuff out there. But especially if you're going to be thinking about going to industry, that's a really important thing to do. Now, I'm going to put another question up here. So we had a question regarding the name of the podcast server. It's Acast, ACAST. I believe it's acast.com. And they have a really good free tier that you can host your podcast on. So I would check out Acast. I have my second podcast, which I don't update, which I update much more than I should. Physiology and Behavior is actually hosted on Acast because it's free. So I will check that out if you're looking to do that. Okay, so this is a great question. Oh, what a good question. Do you have to push back against people who think you're wasting time with social media? Yeah, I get that sometimes. But I think it's... got a few more questions coming through. I'll get to them. This is good. Okay, so when it comes to this, I think you need to demonstrate that it's actually getting you some good results by sharing your work and by actually looking at metrics. A lot of people who complain about people are spending too much time on social media are people that are also obsessed with metrics. So if you can actually demonstrate by posting my work on here, this paper has got this has got X amount of clicks, then it can be a really good way of actually demonstrating to people who are a little bit skeptical that it's quite useful, and even just sharing that. By doing this, there's been talk invitations, there's been networking. Look, but I understand it can be hard, particularly if your supervisor is very worried or your mentor is very worried about what you're doing. But essentially, by demonstrating the benefits that social media is giving you, then I think that can make a big difference. Okay, so okay. Really good question here. Is it a good idea to promote work or figures via social media that is not published or under review? This answer differs between disciplines, but for most disciplines, at least within the biobehavioral sciences, I would say yes, it is a good idea, because you can, because what you can do is most journals are totally fine for you to post preprints. Or to post papers which have been previously posted as a preprint. So by doing that, you can actually talk about your preprint, because it's not actually going to disqualify you from publishing your. It's not going to disqualify you from publishing your work in the journals. And I think this is a really good way of doing it. And it gets a lot of buzz. One thing that I've done, particularly in letters to editors, in writing the cover letter, which I think is more important than a lot of people actually think, is mentioning in the cover letter, okay, as you know, obviously I check whether this particular journal is okay with preprints, but then I say, hey, this preprint has been downloaded 400 times. And by doing that, you're demonstrating to the editor that there's already interest in the work. And so in that sense, you're actually reducing the risk for the editor when it comes to that paper. So I think by doing that, of course you want to check. Of course there are differences between fields, but if your field or if the journal that you're thinking of targeting is cool with preprints, and most of them are, then absolutely this is a good idea. Firstly, for making sure other people are seeing your work, but also for getting feedback. I've gotten such good feedback on my preprints by posting it that way. Okay, now let's get another question up here. This is a good question. What is the most effective way to increase our visibility? Retweeting articles, original blog post. I think that back in the old days when Twitter was quite new and you didn't actually follow that many people, there was a bit of a stigma that you're tweeting too much. Don't tweet too much. You're going to annoy people. But I think now that that people tend to be following hundreds or thousands of people, it's very difficult to tweet too much. And people often ask, well, what should I be tweeting? And I think it's very interesting it's more interesting to be tweeting about the process of your research. If we're only talking about the articles that we're publishing, we're only going to be tweeting every couple of months if you're lucky. Blog posts, which was mentioned in the question, that can also work quite well. But I found in my experience, all things equal, a Twitter thread is actually going to get you way more exposure than a blog post. Check out the book, Twitter for Scientists, and I actually explain why that's the case. But actually going to the trouble and writing and writing a thread instead of a blog post. The thread's quicker as well. That's going to give you most visibility. And the other thing is as well is make sure you're actually talking to people. Twitter and social media is not a one-way street. You can't just be. It's the equivalent of standing outside your building in your university, telling people about your work. You can't just be yelling at people, "This is what I'm doing," but actually be communicating with people and asking questions. Asking questions of other people is a really good way of actually building your network and increasing your visibility. Okay, now this is a really good question. How to persist and regularly create content with a busy academic life and or mental health issues? Yeah, this is a great question. Sometimes for me, it can get a bit much, and I delete Twitter from my phone. If I have a really busy period, if it comes to family or writing grants or a really important paper, I'll delete Twitter from my phone and not post as regularly. And look, sometimes I get the question asking, how do you do you sit down and plan your tweets? Like, I almost never think to myself, what am I going to tweet today? I basically just tweet and share what I'm already doing. So in that sense, there's not a stress around creating stuff because it's the outflow of what I'm already doing. An analogy that I like is this idea of you're using your sawdust. There's a story a long time ago that there was a lumber mill who was throwing away the sawdust, and someone alongside said, there's actually a big market for your sawdust. This is the stuff that you're already creating. Can I buy it off you? And I think that's exactly the same when it comes to actually sharing stuff on social media, in that a lot of stuff you're already making. You're making these codes, your code in R, in order to actually do your work. Share your code. Share your process. Share the interesting articles that you're that you're coming across. There are plenty of ways of doing that. So, but that's a really good question. Of course, your mental health should always come first in these things. Nothing is as important as that. And if you need to take a break, you can take a break, and you can do that, and it's totally fine. Okay, so let's see what else we got here. Okay, how do you stay motivated to do all things like inspiring in addition to the mandatory stuff? Look, this comes back to the same sort of idea that this is just the extras. I'm not sort of thinking about what am I going to share. This is kind of the outflow of what I'm already doing. So when it came to writing that book, when it came to actually writing the book, this was something that this is work that I'm already doing. So I think it's important to be sharing that. And look, yeah, it's look, yes. Sometimes you get a bit tired, and I never want to keep on doing this if I'm over it. But look, I've just found it's such a good way of meeting other people and of finding other research and staying connected. So yeah, that's how I do it. Okay, so unless anyone has any other questions, I might log off because I'm losing my voice a little bit, but that's what happens. So I'm just going to check that I've addressed all the questions, and yes, I will be posting a link to the slides that I used as well. If you do have any other questions, then feel free to get in contact over Twitter. But thanks for logging in, and oh yes, thanks. Getting a few messages there, and hey, maybe I'll do this again soon. So have a good rest of the day or evening wherever you are, and stay safe and stay healthy. See you later.